Good morning and welcome to everyone. The normal way we do this is David Michael gives a little bit of an update on what's happening in the Naval Historical Society. I'll introduce Peter, and then it's over to Peter to tell us all about what his talk is. So over to you, David.
Right. Okay, thanks, Noel. Actually, I don't want to steal any of Noel's thunder, but about 5.5 years ago, Peter presented to the Society on his first book, Australia's Argonauts. You're going to hear more about him, but and his work on subsequent works. But Peter's, as president of the ANI, we tic-tac quite frequently, and the ANI has a great relationship with the Society. And if you haven't looked at the Navy History podcast series, which Peter is the engine room behind through the New South Wales University website, well worth a look. They're excellent podcast. But Noel, over to you.
In January, we had, today we're going to have something very different. In January, we had Desmond Woods, and Desmond held everyone spellbound for 90 minutes, giving great detail on the Falklands War. And in March, we're going to have Nigel, who's watching us today, on the Battle of the River Plate. So today, we're not going to sink ships or explode anything. We're doing something quite different. And as David mentioned, the Naval Studies Group at the Union of New South Wales, the podcasts are excellent. I often use them to put together some of the presentations. And Peter's got 40 years Navy experience, including something in the Iraq War. So without further ado, Peter, it's over to you.
So hello, everyone. I know I'm a hard act to follow after Desmond from last time. In fact, I was saying to Noel, Desmond did that presentation for the Naval Institute, and there was an Indian admiral who was watching it, and he then subsequently got Desmond to redo that presentation to the Indian Naval College in front of about, he had a row of Indian admirals and about 1,000 cadets. So it was certainly much appreciated by them. So the topic that I chose to present was the writing of Australian naval biographies. And it's something I guess I've come dear to my heart, the need for more Australian naval biographies. And so today what I'd like to do is really talk a little bit about the value of biographies to our understanding of naval history, their place in Australian naval historiography, and then talk a little bit about some of the practicalities of writing naval biographies in Australia, and then hopefully have a bit of a discussion period. So the value of biographies. I think the first thing is people are interested in people. Recently, I published the biography of Guy Griffiths, and I've had a number of people, in fact, one last weekend, who said, "Oh, look, I read the book. It took me 2 days to read, and it was great," sort of thing. And I think the reason why people sort of devour books like this is it's just a story about people, and inherently that is what we are interested in. And even in books about battles and so on, it's really the human interest stories that take people's interest. I think that biographies are a great way in which we can expose readers to history, and in this case to Australian naval history. And in the case of Guy Griffiths' book, I consciously call it the life and times, because I think you have to be able to explain the context for that person's life. And one of the things that I did in that book, which I guess was a development of Australia's Argonauts, which in itself, where I was following the lives of 28 13-year-olds all born in 1899, was the thing that became clear in their time was how much the Navy had changed. In Guy's time, it changed, as I say in the book, from having biplanes flying off ships to having jet aircraft on aircraft carriers. But the social fabric of society changes, the social fabric of the Navy changes, and you've got to be able to explain that. And so I think readers get a much richer understanding about the Navy as it evolves through the life of the individual that you're writing about. And one of the things I introduced in the Guy Griffiths book was to actually have footnotes and endnotes, but the footnotes were really to explain, bits and pieces which didn't necessarily, you didn't necessarily want to clog up the book. And so an example of that would be explaining how the rank of Commodore was a temporary rank for a long period of time. How did that sort of work? But also just to be able to explain, what an officer watch does and so on. And I was conscious also with both books, and I think this is something quite specific to Naval Biographies, is that you're conscious also that the reader who may be serving in the current Navy, they will be unfamiliar with lots of things. So whereas some of us would be quite familiar, say, for example, to Jenny's side party and Susie's side party in Hong Kong, or the Chinese laundryman that used to come aboard our ships on deployments, it's not the sort of thing that a modern naval serving member will actually understand. So you've got to be able to explain that. And so I think don't always expect that the current Navy will understand some things of the earlier Navy. So I think that's one of the great things about a biography generally, that it can illuminate a period of time in the Navy through the eyes and through the experiences of the subject you're writing about. And unlike a memoir, you can do a couple of things. One is typically, I think a biography benefits from a richer source of material. So, for example, using primary sources, oral histories, getting views of the subject person you're writing about from other people. So in the case of Guy, what did his ship's company think of him? What did other officers think of him, and so on? The other piece is I think it's important to be able to set the person in context with his contemporaries. So in the case of Guy, one of the things some people say is, well, why didn't he become Chief of Naval Staff? Well, part of that answer is you need to also understand his class, Jim Willis, who was the class member of his group, who became Chief of Navy. So you need to understand that. And probably it gives you a different understanding. So, for example, in Australia's Argonauts with the Pioneer class, they were, I guess, most famous through Collins and Farncombe. Yet when they graduated from the Naval College, the standout personality was Frank Larkins, who was the Chief Cadet Captain. But of course, he fatefully died in 1919 at sea. And so today we never hear of Frank Larkins, but yet he was the sort of leading light in that class. So you do get a bit of a different context. And also you see people like Joe Burnett from who was lost in the Sydney. He was, really neck and neck with John Collins for a long period of their careers. And so, as I said, you can bring a wider source of resources into the writing, typically compared to a memoir. You can offer those assessments of the subject. And not all subjects are in a position to write a memoir. So even someone like Guy Griffiths, 99 now, very, very astute and got a great recall, but he's not going to be wanting to sit down and write a memoir at this stage of his life. And of course, also by writing a biography, you open up to a whole range of people. You could you could potentially write about. So in its place in our Australian naval history literature, there's only about a dozen naval biographies. So I've done a little bit of a list. I'll just sort of read off the ones I can think of. There's and you see some of the books there at the bottom. There's William Clarkson, John Collins, Rupert Long, Eric Felt, David Martin, Ray Parkin, Teddy Sheehan, and of course Tom Lewis's book on Teddy Sheehan recently won the Bateman Book Prize, which shows that interest in biographies. Jefferson Walker with Prize to Admiralty, and of course you got the 1913 entry in the Argonauts book. But there's actually more books written about HMAS Sydney than there are the total number of Australian naval biographies. In contrast, there's many more UK and US naval biographies. And why is that? Well, they've got a longer history, I guess, that's part of it. I think also just with their officers, they typically, the ones written about often been flag officers at sea, and just by the nature of our size of our Navy and all that sort of thing, our officers tend not to have that complete spectrum of sea command right up to flag rank. That may be part of it. It could just be we just haven't got the number of people to write biographies. But there's certainly many more Australian naval memoirs, and they range from things like As Luck Would Have It by John Collins, through to typewritten memoirs by a sailor or an officer of their experiences. And in the Seapower Centre in down here, and also with the Naval Historical Society, there's a number of those which have been done either for families or just to record their service, and they're really important. But it just highlights the much larger number of memoirs than there are biographies. So that's, I think, why there is less biographies. But it's a field which I believe there's a lot of potential subjects out there for people to write about, and I think that's an area which we should really explore. I just want to talk a little bit about, from my practical experience of writing now 2 naval biographies, and I'm currently writing a biography of Vice Admiral Sir Albert Poland. Albert Poland is a British admiral. He had a sort of quite an interesting career, not too dissimilar to Guy Griffiths in terms of but in his case, Albert Poland served in World War I and World War II. His connection to Australia, his son Peter Poland lives here, and Albert Poland ran the Tobruk ferry run from Tobruk. So there's an Australian connection, but it's the reason I've raised that is it gives me a little bit of a sense about trying to write a biography about a British subject compared to an Australian subject. So the benefits we have in Australia when it comes to writing a biography are a couple. One is our national archives are much more complete compared to UK and US. Now, part of that from the US side is they had a fire in the 70s in their archives, and so there were a large number of military archives were lost. In terms of the UK compared to Australia, so for example, for us, you can pretty much get the complete confidential reports of officers from the archives. In comparison, in the UK, you can get the officers posting record sheet, and they'll have extracts from some of their 206 forms. So it's a less complete picture. We have a more complete group of reported proceedings from ships' activities. So just some of the reports and basic archival material are more complete here. We benefit a lot from Trove, the National Library of Australia website, which helps pull together where books are, where papers are kept, and of course having the great ability to do word searches of newspapers. The other thing from the National Library, which is of tremendous value, is just having the library membership and being able to access their eager resources. So you can, it's essentially a bit like having a library, university library access, where you can search a large number of global databases for papers and newspapers in particular, but also academic papers. So that's a really great resource for us. Sea Power Centre and indeed the Historical Centre are great resources of very useful information, and where some people leave their papers. The Ad for Library is absolutely fantastic. It's, I would say, without a doubt, the best military and naval library around. And in these days where libraries are cutting back material, or in fact the Defence Libraries, many of those branches are being shut. The Ad for Library is a very precious resource, and it benefits from having, for example, the Duntroon Library put into it, the Naval Institute put in a whole bunch of books, and it continues to be well resourced. The difficulties of writing a biography in Australia are a couple of things. Personal papers, there's less of a tradition of leaving papers in Australia than, say, in the UK. They also tend to be a bit all over the place. And so, for example, there are some quite good papers in the War Memorial, but unless the person has had long war service, it's not the place where you would find them. And sometimes they won't have the complete papers of someone, only their war service. So I think that's something that more work needs to be done to encourage people to leave papers, and also advertise where is the best sort of place to leave papers. The Ad for Library, for example, has a archival section where they're trying to encourage people to leave papers. Sea Power Centre has some, as indeed the Historical Society, and the National Library has a number, but sometimes a little bit hard to find where they are, but they're an invaluable source of information for any budding biographer. One of the other challenges is just modern subjects are more difficult to track and to get information. So to give you a couple of practical examples from a naval side is in the 70s, the Navy moved to EDP, so the posting cards which detail where people were, they disappeared, and you just see a stamp transferred to EDP, and then it's extremely hard then to track where people were. And also the Navy lists. The Navy list went from being issued a couple of times a year, and in particular what was invaluable was being able to see what the wardroom complements were in each ship. So you could actually not only track where your subject was, but who else was on that ship. And certainly when I was doing the Argonauts book, that was invaluable to actually start to see the network of why was someone friends with so-and-so. It was because they served on 2 ships prior, it's that sort of thing. Well, of course, these days that no longer exists. So it's a harder thing. And of course, in more recent times, the files are digitized and so difficult to get. You don't have the pen script annotations on files. And also people don't write letters as much. A great source I found for the Argonauts book was in fact Captain James Armstrong, his letters in National Library. He wrote essentially home every Sunday for decades, and so that's a tremendous source of information about what's going on. The other thing is just in terms of publishing. It's a great thing that Tom Lewis's book was won a prize, and there's interest in getting a book by readers and reading biographies. But my personal experience is it's very hard to get a publisher for a naval biography. And some of the publishers say, look, how many biographies are there on the Navy? It's easier if you had an Army biography as an example. And so it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg. But but I think we just got to accept the fact it is a bit of a niche field, and if you can sell, say, 2,000 copies, you're doing pretty well, I would suggest. But there's, as Guy's book attests, is there's some fascinating people to write about, and readers become very engaged when they read a good subject in a biography. So I'd now like to just go to Q&A, and perhaps one point that could be useful to discuss is actually who are the subjects out there who could be the subject to future Australian naval biographies. So I'll just minimise my screen now and welcome any questions. So just to kick the ball rolling, if I can, the sort of people I would suggest that we could there could be biographies about. One is William Creswell. He's had a PhD thesis done on him, but one on him, Vat Smith, Harold Farncombe, probably one of the brightest officers not to become Chief of Navy. Heckwaller would be one. Harry Howden would, I think, make a very interesting biography. Are there any other suggestions of people that they can think of?
Well, Peter, my question would be, when the research takes 3-5 years plus, how do you keep yourself motivated, especially when you've got a lot of other balls in the air? Obviously, selecting the person is key, the subject, and as you said, there's many of them. But for you, what were the criteria that you used?
Yeah, so, well, in fact, the Argonauts took 15 years. So Argonauts took 15 years and 3 years to do one particular chapter, the interwar chapter, just because it was so difficult to do. I think in the case of the Argonauts book, there was so much that was new and unknown, and it was a completely fascinating story. And you tended to, you also formed a bond with the families of 28 people, and at that time I was writing it, while there was no one of the pioneer class left alive, there was still the sons and daughters. In fact, some are still alive, but many of them were in their 80s. So you actually had a responsibility to get this bloody book done, and to the point where I was sending chapters to the descendants as I went. But I think in that case, it really highlighted the social fabric of a navy and how it evolved and changed, but also just going back to the archives. So to give an example of things that were unknown, there was in Nurse's diary was the only place where all the members of the pioneer class who served on the K boats was listed. Ernie Cunningham, as many of you know, was lost in one of the K boats in the Battle of May Island. But the reason it wasn't listed anywhere was all those midshipmen were actually in the Glorious, and the Glorious went into refit. And if you can picture the scene of the commander coming into the wardroom of Glorious saying, "Okay, you lot, I've organised each one of you going to spend a month on a submarine," and off they went. Of course, there was no posting note. So through Eddie Nurse's diary was the full list, and also then going to the archive in UK and seeing that the archive for that accident had been shut, I think it was till 1987. And so a lot of the history that had been written hadn't benefited from having this file, which had only been opened all those years after the event. So that story was only really able to be told by putting that all together. And of course, the other thing with Guy's story is, as I said to Guy, success looks like at the book launch, you're signing the books, which I mean, Guy's fairly indestructible, but, like I couldn't really dally too much. And the great benefit with that book was actually being able to share chapters with guys. So our routine was that he'd done a few oral histories and presentations, as you well know. I put that together with the research I did in UK and here, put that together in a draft, gave it to Guy. He would then do typical captain's editing and corrections. But then we would then sit down again, because to give an example of how things work with a memoir, it tends to be what the person who's writing the memoir, he'll write what he wants to write, but sometimes you will want to write about something slightly different. And to give an example, in the Repulsed chapter, I talk about the Field Marshal Smuts came on board Repulse and talked to the ship's company. The reason I mentioned that was the Repulse was out there looking for German raiders, but when Smuts came on board and addressed the ship's company, he wanted to alert them to the threat of Japan if they come into the war, what that meant. And Guy had never mentioned that, but listening to oral histories online from the Imperial War Museum, every repulsed sailor talked about that address. And so I asked Guy about it. He said, "Oh yeah, I can remember that," and then gave quite a vivid recollection of it. And so I guess that sort of shows that difference of approach from a biographer to a memoir.
Peter, I'd describe your presentation as a do-it-yourself kit for any budding author that wanted to write a biography. Could you have a look on chat? There's a few questions there that you might like to comment or answer, if you can bring chat up.
Yeah, sure. I've got that. I've got that here, and I'll certainly provide those slides to Noel, Chris, for that. What's the difference between a biography and a memoir? That's a good question, and I'll get to you, Chris, in a sec. I don't think there is a difference, actually. I think probably the only possible thing is a memoir may just be a more truncated part of someone's life and could still be classed as a memoir. But I think a biography tends to cover the whole lot. In terms of a word length, when I started off, I asked a few of the mainstream publishers what's acceptable. Generally speaking, it's about 80,000 words is for a biography. Having said that, like the Argonauts book is, I think it's about 120. It's about 600 words, 600 pages. But and that's the benefit of a small publisher like Echo Books. But generally speaking, 80,000 words. Chris, over to you.
Thank you. I put a brief mention in the chat, but I've actually got an expanded comment and then a question for you, if I may. I've got 4 candidates, which all of whom I think are worthy of biographies. I'd be interested in yours and other views. Peter Briggs, but also Bill Owen, as very much instrumental in the re-establishment of the submarine force within the Australian Navy. Adrian Cummins, and perhaps most worthy, Andrew Robertson, who over 10 years ago first advocated nuclear submarines and has been a great advocate of the Fleet Air Arm, and I think has done a great deal to contribute to the ongoing development of the Navy, and should be properly appreciated. My question, though, is as a newly elected member of the board of the Royal United Services Institute, New South Wales, I wonder what your view is of what they regard as a jewel in the crown of the Ursula Davidson Library. It's tended to be more military, but it does have some significant naval content. Have you had occasion to consult it, and do you have a view on it?
No, to be honest, I've never heard of it. Is it readily accessible?
It is now. It was locked up in Defence New South Wales in Remington, so it was very difficult to get to, but it's now publicly available. It's physically located underneath the Anzac Memorial in Hyde Park.
Okay.
It's the scope of it, I don't know exactly the number of entries in the catalogue, but it's many hundreds. For example, I went looking on the Falklands War, and they've got a small shelf of about 15 volumes written by various people and so on. But I do think it should be considered along with your other very helpful list of resources.
Okay, thanks, Chris, and thanks also for those names. I mean, it's interesting. When we did one of the early podcasts on the Oberon class, and just seeing the role of people like Bill Owen, but in particular Peter Briggs with the Submarine Weapons Update Program, it would certainly be excellent to be able to capture that while Peter's still firing on all cylinders.
And by the way, he's still very active. He's been recently employed by Defence to do manpower planning for a potential nuclear submarine arm.
Yeah, he's certainly been a great talent for us for our podcast series, and if his ones on AE1 and AE2 are fantastic.
Thank you.
Peter?
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
No, go.
One possible candidate might be Stoker of AE2 fame, seeing we're on a submarine theme here. He not only the First World War career, but he went through to serving in the Second World War, albeit mainly in public relations.
Yeah.
So that's one place we could go down in terms of moving away from admirals.
Yeah. Yeah.
Scores in the winners there. There's one biography that's sort of part Navy that's missing there, and that's Joe Hewitt's biographies. The black one and the other one escapes me, who was a crossover from Navy to Air Force.
Yes, there was a few of those, wasn't there? There's a question about what's a typical structure. One of the things I found with with the Argonauts book, I used as a guide, there's Atkinson's book on the thin blue line, which is the story of a class of West Point cadets. So I use that as a guide. It's just weaving in Atkinson's case, he didn't have 28, he had less people in his story. He just took a selection from that West Point class and what they did. But the basic construct of trying to weave a narrative story and tell it as a story. With the Guy Griffiths book, like many of you, I sort of grown up on reading typically British naval biographies, and so I wanted to write a classic, proper, old-fashioned biography. Where really starting from the family heritage and move on. But one of the things I got told by Alan and Unwin when I was sort of sounding them out, mainly about what size to write, was to do a prologue at the beginning to get the reader engrossed. And so that's why I did a prologue, and the attack that Guy experienced in the camera was a classic little episode that set the scene, and you could sort of introduce the book a bit more. So, so I think that there is benefit in just having that sort of that traditional sort of biographical construct. So I'll just scroll down if I can. Why don't publishers want Navy biographers generally? They tend to just look at the market and say that's a small market. It's a much bigger market for military histories and naval histories. But my observation then is it's a matter of just finding a publisher who is happy to do that. So, for example, So Australian Scholarly Press did Guy Griffiths' book, and they liked the story and the quality of the story, and their ambitions to how many to sell, and also the overheads that they had were quite different. But you know, like Allen and Unwin, to actually get them to publish it, they needed me to underwrite the publishing of it. So I had to take all the risks associated with that, and I didn't have as deep of pockets that they required for the thing to get off the ground.
Peter, it's Walter Burrows. Can I say a couple of words about memoirs and
Yes, please.
biography?
Yes, please.
Biographies, as you've explained, they take an immense amount of research, and they're something that are not over and done within months. They can take years. But we get lots of memoirs. You know, these come from family resources, and they're sent to us. And what do we do with them? And some we file, and others we have to think about. But I frequently find small stories from these, and you know, I've got a couple now. I think the memoir might be 50 pages long, and you have to put this together into something of context that can be useful to our naval community, if you like. So these are very likely brought down to about 6 pages long or something like that. But do you think this is a worthwhile thing that we do, and should we formalize it better? Because these are interesting little stories, and they give a glimpse of naval activity quite possibly overlooked. I know I'm doing one now on a Garden Island apprentice, and he's a very clever young man, and he gives us a glimpse into what happened at Garden Island over 4 or 5 years, which we mightn't otherwise see.
Yeah, so has been some discussion in the past about trying to take excerpts from people's memoirs or their recollections and actually putting that into a compendium. And I know Joe Strazik, when he was at the Sea Power Centre, he actually did some work on that. So try and look chronologically in the development of the Navy from the colonial navies and have recollections from different people as a sort of, you know, like Australian Naval Voices, that sort of thing. So you could potentially do a book like that, or maybe it's a thing of putting it online and having those as a resource for people to access. Certainly one of the things I've found very useful, which is easier from the British side, is in the Imperial War Museum, you can very readily access a lot of oral histories just online and just listen to them. It's a little bit, there's fewer of those in the Australian context, but they provide a great resource for, you know, other works. And you can imagine with those sorts of recollections, if they're online somewhere, they could be accessed and help with other sort of work, or just be read on their own merits. There's a question there, writing a bio for the Australian Dictionary of Biography, and in fact, Carl James has just recently taken over from David Horner as the lead for the military section of the Australian Dictionary of Biography, and in fact, my son's actually doing one on a naval legal subject. But those dictionary biography entries are a fantastic intro for people to get into the biography sort of realm. It's a good discipline of having to try to distill it all in a fairly finite amount of words, but I think it's a great breeding ground for biographers. That's certainly how I started off. I did John Collins and David Martin to start, and before, you know, I'd done any book. So I think that's a great activity to get involved in. And Carl James, I know, is always on the lookout for more people to write, and also for ideas of subjects of people who should be the subject of an entry.
Do we have any more questions for Peter? That's been an excellent discussion. A lot of interest in the topic.
There's just one from Andy McKinnon just about Hastings Harrington and Henry Burrell. I reckon Arch Harrington would be a really good one. We last year we did a fascinating podcast on the Navy in the Gulf in 1941, including Yarra's involvement in the Anglo-Iraqi War and then the Anglo-Iranian War. And this year we're doing our first podcast of the year is with Simon Harrington again, with the rescue of the survivors from the Taiping. I don't know if you're all aware of the Taiping. It was lost between mainland China and Taiwan in 1949. Hastings Harrington was CO Warramunga, and over 1,500 people were lost in that disaster. And I agree with you about Arch Harrington, because the more I've now come to appreciate his career, it would be a fascinating story, and one that sort of course, goes through the travails of Voyager. So, Noel, I'll hand it. Oh, wait there, John.
Yeah, John Seymour's got his hand up. John, are you unmuted?
Yes, I think so. Am I on the air?
Yeah, you're fine.
Okay. Peter, I wonder if you can give me some advice. I'm feeling rather old and realizing I'm not indestructible. I have accumulated a substantial collection of naval books over the years, and you have praised the ADFA Naval History Collection. Yep. There may be some other people who have books. The general experience is that libraries don't want books anymore. They don't want to use the space. Can you give me advice as to how I might find out whether my collection would be of interest to the ADFA library?
Yes, so probably there's a couple of things. Is they have two sections, so they have a stack separate to the library. So not every book is on the shelf, and so really it's a question of do they have the book you have?
Correct.
And you can actually search their library just online, and you can see individually. That's one way of doing it, accepting the fact that they'll have a pretty good collection. But if there's ones you think that are unusual, they will almost certainly take. We regularly give them books that they haven't got, and they will take. There's probably other. I'm sure there's other ones around, but I know your point is quite valid that many libraries are deterring taking books, and I mean it was just a crying shame that Defence, closed their libraries. I and a number of people went to the Russell Defence Library when it was being shut, and just taking books to take to the university. And it's just criminal that they would get rid of that library, and they're shutting the Naval College Library as well. So,
yeah. But I certainly don't want to work through the library catalogue. I've got some books which I believe would be interesting and valuable. What do I do? Do I just ring the library and ask for someone to assess my collection? How do I proceed?
I can give Noel a number for the head librarian.
Oh, thank you very much.
Could I jump in there as well, John? The society itself, obviously you're in Canberra,
yes,
but the society is always on the lookout for additions to our collection, which is a very comprehensive and valuable asset. Unfortunately, in the next 6 months, while we're in temporary office space, the library is going to be stored. But so our librarian at the moment is going to be particularly interested in receiving any personal collections to keep her occupied as well.
Mm-hmm.
But, we often pass them on to other people as well if we've got the books in the collection. So,
Thank you.
The other people who happily take books is the Sea Power Centre.
Yes, I know the people at the Sea Power Centre. Thank you. It
Yeah.
just seems to be a little remote from the centre of Canberra, and people will not know about its library in contrast with the ADFA library.
Yeah, so I think that's true, and one of the things I've said to people is, if you are going to write something about Australian naval history, you really do have to go see the Sea Power Centre and just see what they have, and that they're a good source of advice about.
No, I'm already benefiting from their help.
Yeah. Edwin, do you had a question?
Peter was in front of me, actually. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Peter.
However,
Peter, do you want to go first?
Peter, you need to unmute yourself.
I've got a very quick question, which is just to clarify something that you said before, Peter, and thanks very much for your talk, by the way. It's been really interesting. But the question is, did you say that the ADB you could contact, say, an editor at the Australian Dictionary of Biography and ask and say, well, look, I'd like to write this and have this published about this person, and they'll sort of tell you, well, we think that'd make it or it wouldn't.
Oh, so the way it works is, each area of society, like legal, military, and all that sort of thing, have a coordinator. And Carl James from the War Memorial is the coordinator for the military section. So he's got a group. What they do is they then look at the next epoch that they're writing about, like when an age bracket of when people died. They will then have candidates that they decide, yep, we should have an entry about that person. They then make up that list, and then they then go sourcing for writers of that entry. But having said that, I'm sure if you went to Carl to say, look, I'm interested in being, one of a contributor, and by the way, you may want to think about this person. Obviously, they're looking at a particular bracket of when people died. So anyone prior to that, they're not interested in. Anyone, not, still into the future, but has died already, that they may get added to the list, but they're not actually interested in that group at that time. But if you look, just dig up Carl's email is on the website for the War Memorial.
Oh, thanks very much.
Are there any more questions? What a fantastic discussion. What incredible interest in the topic, Peter. You probably didn't anticipate the level of interest and comment and suggestions.
Well, it just highlights that my initial comment that people are interested in people.
So unless there's more to go, David, do you want to make a final comment?
No, just to add to your thanks, Noel. Thank you, Peter. Very interesting, and hopefully we've inspired lots of other authors to get on with it.
That's it.
There's plenty of subjects.
That's the whole purpose of it, and there's great stories out there.